Sometimes the most decisive shifts in the Church do not announce themselves with thunder or controversy. They arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, hidden behind carefully chosen words and official calm. A document is published, a statement is released, and on the surface everything appears stable and controlled. Headlines flash briefly, commentators exchange opinions, experts argue over phrasing and theological nuance, and many assume that once the text is written and approved, the matter is finished. Yet it is often precisely at that moment that the real story begins. The deepest movements in the Church rarely originate in press briefings or Vatican offices. They rise instead from far humbler places, parish halls, family kitchens, quiet chapels, and ordinary believers whose faith is not lived on paper, but through prayer, devotion, and trust shaped over a lifetime. That is where this story took root. Not in centers of power, not among academic elites, and not as an act of rebellion, but as a wound felt by the faithful themselves. As Pope Leo XIV's pontificate entered a particularly sensitive phase, an unexpected fracture surfaced. It could not be explained away as ideology, nostalgia, or resistance to change. It touched something deeply personal and profoundly sacred in Catholic life, the figure of the Virgin Mary and the way the Church speaks about her. For outsiders, the issue might appear technical or abstract. For those living it, it was neither. It was intimate, painful, and deeply spiritual. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. The spark did not come from Rome. It came from the diocese of Chiclayo in Peru, a local church with a long and personal familiarity with the current pope. This was not a distant or hostile community, nor one unfamiliar with his pastoral vision. On the contrary, it was a place shaped by shared history, trust, and lived ecclesial experience. In many ways, it felt like home. That made what followed impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or opposition. Shortly after a doctrinal document was issued by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, something subtle began to stir among the faithful of Chiclayo. There were no protests, no slogans, no social media storms. Instead, there was confusion. There was sadness. There was a quiet sense of spiritual dislocation. Ordinary Catholics began speaking to one another after Mass. Parents, elderly parishioners, young families, and long-time devotees of Marian prayer compared homilies. They noticed pauses where confidence once lived, silences where words had once flowed freely. They sensed hesitation in their priests, caution where there had once been assurance. Slowly and painfully, they realized that something had changed in how they were allowed to speak about their mother. This was not a scholarly debate or an academic quarrel. It was the lived faith of people who had grown up praying the Rosary, honoring Marian feasts, and being taught from childhood that Mary was not a distant symbol, but a living mother who listens, intercedes, and walks with her children. Their spiritual language had been shaped by centuries of tradition, rich with meaning and care, Mary as mediatrix, Mary as co-redemptrix, always subordinate to Christ, entirely dependent on him, yet uniquely involved in the mystery of salvation through her free consent and her union with his suffering. Suddenly, that language felt unsafe. Priests hesitated before preaching. Catechists stopped themselves mid-sentence. Homilies were softened, shortened, or avoided altogether. This was not because these shepherds had lost faith or conviction, but because they feared crossing an invisible line. They feared contradicting what now seemed to be an official direction. They feared saying too much, or saying the wrong thing. When a parish priest feels unable to speak freely about Mary during the Feast of the Miraculous Medal, a celebration saturated with Marian meaning, something fundamental has shifted. This was no longer theoretical. It was pastoral reality. The faithful felt it immediately. Celebrations felt hollow. Devotions felt constrained. Words once spoken with joy now felt watched and regulated. The true gravity of the situation lay not simply in what the document said, but in what it made impossible to say. Faith, when lived defensively, begins to suffocate. When believers feel compelled to censor their love for the Mother of God, something essential is wounded. And so the faithful of Chiclayo chose a path that was both courageous and humble. They wrote a letter. It was not an angry manifesto or a public accusation. It was a filial appeal. Over 100 signatures were gathered within days, not from activists or polemicists, but from ordinary Catholics who lived their faith quietly and faithfully. The tone was sober and restrained, yet unmistakably marked by pain. They spoke openly of sadness, bewilderment, and scandal, not scandal as spectacle, but scandal in its deepest theological sense, that which causes stumbling, that which troubles the little ones, that which disorients the people of God. They were careful with their words. They did not accuse the Pope. They did not challenge authority or demand change. They pleaded. "Do not make our mother suffer," they wrote. These words did not emerge from abstract theory, but from lived devotion passed down through generations. For them, Mary was not an idea, but a real mother who stood at the foot of the cross, not passively, but actively and spiritually united to the sacrifice of her Son. They insisted that this understanding was not a novelty or exaggeration. It was part of the Church's living memory, articulated by saints, taught by popes, and embodied in the faith of the people. That was what made the moment so charged. The issue was not innovation, but continuity. They were not asking the Church to invent something new. They were asking her not to forget what she had always known. At first, the story might have remained local, a heartfelt expression of concern contained within one diocese. But it did not. Something unexpected happened. The appeal traveled. It reached Rome. It spread beyond Peru and began resonating internationally. What started as a diocesan letter became a global question. Soon, those tasked with guarding Marian doctrine took notice. The Theological Commission of the International Marian Association intervened with a formal document whose weight could not be ignored. They described the doctrinal trajectory suggested by the dicasteris note as an example of anti-development of doctrine. This was rare and severe language, used with deliberation. Anti-development does not suggest organic growth or clarification, but regression and rupture. The Commission reminded the Church that the Marian titles under discussion were not fringe or careless expressions. They had been used by popes, saints, and theologians with precision and theological depth. To dismiss them wholesale was not to safeguard doctrine, but to imply that centuries of the Church's teaching life had been mistaken. At this point, the tension deepened further. What was at stake was no longer only Marian devotion, but the credibility of doctrinal continuity itself. Was the Church now suggesting that what had long been preached and prayed was suddenly inappropriate? Was tradition being quietly reclassified as excess? And if so, who was deciding this, and by what authority? As these questions intensified, silence from Rome grew heavier. Then, at the moment of greatest tension, another unexpected development occurred. A voice from within the Vatican's own doctrinal structure broke the stillness. Maurizio Gronchi, a consultant to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, spoke publicly on EWTN. With careful words, he stated that there was no absolute prohibition on the Marian titles in question. They were not condemned. They were not banned. They remained legitimate within popular devotion. They simply should not appear in official documents or liturgical texts. For some, this was reassuring. For others, it deepened the unease. The original document had not spoken in this nuanced way. It had not drawn distinctions or offered pastoral explanation. It had sounded unconditional, definitive, and punitive. The new clarification felt like an undeclared correction. And the very need to offer reassurance confirmed what many already sensed: confusion had spread. When Catholics must be told not to feel confused, confusion already exists. At this point, the story moved beyond Marian theology and into the heart of ecclesial credibility. Confusion in the Church never remains neutral. It spreads quietly through parishes, seminaries, catechesis, and personal prayer. Unlike open disagreement, it hides behind obedience. People comply outwardly while struggling inwardly to understand what they are now permitted to believe or express. Monsignor Gronkai's clarification acknowledged continuity and denied prohibition, yet it also exposed a fracture between what was written and how it was now being explained. If the document did not intend to silence Marian language, why did it read as though it did? If the titles remained legitimate, why were priests afraid to use them? If nothing essential had changed, why did everything feel unstable? These were not questions of critics, but of the faithful. The issue ceased to be merely Marian. It became ecclesiological, pastoral, and deeply tied to authority and trust. How could the people of God orient themselves when a doctrinal note approved by the Pope was later softened in a television interview? Doctrine in the Church is not only about truth. It is about trust, trust that public teaching reflects genuine intention, trust that clarification will not contradict proclamation, trust that the faithful will not be left navigating contradictions alone. That trust felt strained. As explanations multiplied, fragility increased. Some priests felt vindicated, others exposed. Lay faithful were left asking where certainty could be found if even experts appeared to correct one another. Inevitably, attention turned to Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. His role drew scrutiny not because of malice, but because the document seemed to embody a broader tension long present in the Church, the tension between academic theology and lived faith, between systematic caution and devotional language, between intellectual frameworks and the sensus fidelium. The Church has always distinguished between dogma and devotion, but she has never treated devotion as disposable. Marian piety has long been a place where doctrine becomes human and accessible. Restricting its language without pastoral accompaniment reshapes the spiritual landscape, and that is precisely what the faithful felt. As unease grew, appeals multiplied. Father Serafino Maria Lanzetta issued a global filial plea, inviting priests and laypeople to sign. The response was swift, not driven by anger, but by a shared sense that something vital was at stake. They were not asking for new dogmas or new titles. They were asking for unity, for a word that heals rather than divides, for clarity that restores confidence. Gradually, everything converged on Pope Leo XIV. Not as an adversary, but as the guarantor of unity. What made the moment especially charged was that the appeal came from a diocese deeply connected to his own pastoral history. A plea from one spiritual family cannot be dismissed lightly. Silence followed. In Catholic life, silence can be prayerful or prudent, but it can also wound. As days passed, speculation grew. Beneath it all lay a truth often underestimated: Mary is never a secondary issue. Touching her titles touches how Catholics understand salvation, suffering, and maternal love. For countless believers, Mary is where faith became personal and tender. The question now was no longer purely theological. Would the Pope speak? Would he clarify? Would he heal? Or would the faithful be left navigating between documents and interviews, devotion and caution? The Church has stood at such crossroads before. History shows that how these moments are handled shapes trust for generations. Beneath every debate lies a deeper question: what kind of Church is speaking, and how does she speak to her children? Mary has never been an accessory to Catholic faith. She has been its refuge. The faithful are not questioning Christ's unique role in redemption. They are asking whether the Church still has room to speak of Mary's cooperation without fear. They fear not the loss of a word, but the loss of a vision, one in which salvation is relational, not mechanical, maternal, not distant. In moments like this, the Church does not need louder arguments. She needs a father's voice. One that clarifies without humiliating, reassures without dismissing, and recognizes the pain of the faithful as real. The Pope alone can restore coherence, not by choosing sides, but by explaining clearly and pastorally. The danger is not schism, but quiet disengagement. Yet there is hope. The faithful did not leave. They did not rebel. They spoke with reverence and trust. And that trust deserves an answer. At the foot of the cross, Mary did not argue. She stood. Perhaps that is what the Church is being called to do now, to stand with her people, to listen, and to remember that doctrine, when separated from love, becomes fragile. The documents will pass. The memory of how the faithful were treated will remain. And so they wait. In prayer. In hope. And with Mary. If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts in the comment or comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.